Good evening. My name is Carmine DeFilio. I am the director of the Sabancı University, Istanbul International Center for Energy and Climate, which we call IICEC. I will be hosting the webinar this evening. It's called Energy and Climate Consequences of the COVID-19 Pandemic. We have four great panelists to give us their perspectives and answer our questions. However, before I begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to announce that IICEC will be hosting a second webinar on a similar topic, COVID-19 Global and Turkey Energy Assessment. I mention this now because our event will include Ms. Güler Sabancı, the chairman of Sabancı Holding, founding chairman of Sabancı University's Board of Trustees, and also chairman of IICEC's Board of Directors. Dr. Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency and honorary chairman of IICEC's Board of Directors, will also participate, and Mr. Kıvanç Zaimler, the TÜSİAD Energy Working Group president, as well as having several energy industry and NGO roles. This webinar will take place later this month, and as soon as we finalize all the details, we will send out the registration link. I would also like to thank IICEC's board members for their support. They are Borusan ENBW, EnergySaw, NG, Aaron Holding, Petrofisi, Senko Energy, Shell, SOCAR, and Zolar Energy. Now, back to our webinar this evening. We will begin with short statements by each of our panelists and then engage them freely with our questions. As we promised, we will be receiving your questions and they will be able to relay them to our panel. We want to make this webinar as interactive as possible. Our panelists are Dr. Yaşar Arıçak, founder and board member of the Footprint and Sustainability Organization, an organization devoted to fighting climate change. Ms. Dayar Bodin, founding partner of Bodin Law. Bodin Law itself has hosted many seminars with a particular focus on how international law affects energy investments and progress towards fighting climate change. Professor Ahmet Evan, emeritus professor at Sabancı University. Among other things, Ahmet Bey is well known for his expertise on the geopolitics of energy. And Ambassador Mithat Rendi, who before retirement represented Turkey in key energy negotiations, and likewise and is expert on the geopolitics of energy. Yaşar Bey, would you please begin?
Okay, thank you, Carmine. Good evening. While my friends will be speaking about the effect of COVID on the energy and the demand, I'll be speaking about its effect on the climate and what we should be doing, because this is at the end of it, this is a global event. So we should be looking at what the world is doing and what the world should be doing. That's what I'm going to speak about. Now, the COVID has reminded many of us about the environment, because we see clear waters, clear air, the dolphins in the Bosphorus, etc. So many people associated the COVID with the climate, and that made us realize that with knowledge, with collaboration, and with discipline, we can overcome this event. So similarly, although such a distant event, when the climate change arrives here, similarly with knowledge and with determination, we can overcome the problem with it. We only now realize that distant events can come very fast, and that's what exactly happened. If you remember, some of you might have seen a cartoon where COVID is a wave that's coming, and behind it there is a bigger wave, which is the climate change. Now, we are talking about climate change, but there's another problem that's associated with climate change, and it's our effect on the environment. So these two jointly feeding into each other is a very important problem defining our times. The climate change is not just the hurricanes, it's not just rains, floods, etc., but it's more than that. It's desertification, it's drought, it's famine, it's mass migration, it's refugees, and at the end, it's a security problem. So that's why it's important. So what needs to be done? What needs to be done? I think this has been said earlier. We have to listen to the science. So what does the science say? Science tells us that we need to reduce our emissions to zero. We need to make an energy budget. Carbon budget is what we have been allowed to emit before we reach warming degrees. So just keep this one number, for example. For a 2-degree warming of the global world, to have a better than 50% chance, we can only emit 500 gigatons of carbon emissions. That means, given that we are currently emitting about 33 gigatons, within 15 years, we have to reduce our emissions to zero, and we must not emit anymore. That has been said back in 2012 by OECD Secretary General. He said, by the second half of this century, we have to reduce our emissions to zero. So we have such an important item going forward. And what has the countries done? I'll just talk about this Paris Agreement. The countries have finally came together in 2015, and they signed an agreement at Paris, which is called Paris Climate Agreement. That was the initial response to this great problem. I think I'll pass now here. Maybe I can answer your questions over what's being done, what should be done later in the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll go on to our next panelist. I believe it's Dare Bowden.
Thank you, Carmine. Thank you for this opportunity. I would like to start with a few lessons we learned from the COVID pandemic. It is a global crisis, and global crisis requires strong and urgent collaboration of public and private sector. We need to work together to tackle global challenges like COVID or climate change. The next global challenge is likely to be climate change related. There is no clear evidence showing the relationship between climate change and pandemic yet. However, we cannot ignore the environmental root causes of both events. They both originate from the human activity on nature, humans' destruction of the environment, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, or change of land use change. These are all human activities on nature, and we cannot ignore the environmental root cause of the pandemic. German Federal Environment Minister describes pandemic as a wake-up call for humanity. It's a warning of the nature to humans, and this is an opportunity for us to refocus on sustainability and responsible investment. If the climate change reaches the point of no return, its consequences might be even worse. And currently, countries are preparing their recovery packages. And I believe the recovery packages should not only focus on short-term recovery plans, but also long-term sustainable development plans. And we need to find a way to balance economic development and public health, public welfare, and sustainability. I believe the keywords that we will be using in the next decade would be public health, public welfare, and sustainability. In the international law, in the international human rights law, that will be a transformation to cover environmental rights in the international human rights law. And in terms of international investment law, I believe there will be more interaction with the international human rights law. So as lawyers, we need to focus more on human rights issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to Amit Bey, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Carmine. It's a great pleasure for me to meet some friends and some newly acquired friends on this panel. And I'd like to thank you for your invitation for me to join this. It's a great occasion to address the energy issue at the time of crisis. And the two previous speakers, and I think, have pointed to the most important aspect of it. Will this crisis lead to a focus on renewable energy and the environment? I am not the person to expert on that, but I will say one sentence at the end of this short introduction. We have a great crisis, the first of its kind that has affected every walk of life and every economy, whether you're a producing country of energy in any way, clean or otherwise. If you are a country that is dependent on imported energy, it is affected. Well, two immediate questions come to mind. One is that it is a bit too early to say, to assess the damage of this to the sector as a whole, because we do not have the data yet to project whether this fall in demand will recover, and if it does recover without a second wave setting us back, at which rate it will recover. So whatever we might say at the discussions later on, we have to keep in mind that we are basically projecting on the data we have at present. And that data brings us to the second point, that several questions are raised with regard to changing consumption patterns. The next speaker, Ambassador Rende, will address the issue with oil. I would say that natural gas will not show the kind of loss of demand that oil seems to be reflecting right now. There are several reasons for this. We can come back to it, but two aspects of it I think we can emphasize right at the beginning. One is that the prices are falling. Prices are falling in unexpected ways. I just read in the Financial Times, was it yesterday, that in fact natural gas prices in the European market have come below the prices in the US market, which was not an expected outcome of anything. It is quite surprising, but that has an implication on shifting the geopolitics of gas altogether. The other factor is, of course, for a variety of reasons, power production is becoming more important, both because of environmental considerations and the rising share of renewables in power production. And gas is an important and much cleaner fuel to feed contribute to power production. The last thing I want to say, and I said I would say something about it, is that we have, of course, looking at the situation right now, we have a great problem with investments. The sector everywhere is squeezed for money. There are actually oil and gas shale producers in the United States going out of business right now, or seeking protection from Chapter 11 protection from bankruptcy and so on. And investments across the sector have fallen and likely to not recover in the remainder of this year because loss is there, and it is not likely that these companies will recover these losses to put extra money into investments. Now, that brings us back to some possibly, speculatively, good news on the renewables sector, because renewables are cheaper. The construction of turbine plants is cheaper. Certainly, solar PVs are cheaper, and the renewable sector does not, as far as I can see right now, is lacking, at least in interest in investments. Thank you. Over to you, Carmine.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And then we'll move on to Mithat Bey, please.
Thank you, Carmine. Let me start by expressing my sincere thanks to you as the director of Istanbul International Center for Energy and Climate Change. It's a prominent think tank in this field and in many other activities. We appreciate your support to the energy sector also. May I also thank your team, the IICEC team, and all who have helped prepare this timely seminar. I'm delighted to be with such distinguished panelists. COVID-19 represents a turning point, in fact, in human history. Maybe this was said several times by prominent figures, and also what was said is that that things will change, and it will never be, the world will never be the same again after COVID-19 is fought properly. But unfortunately, it led to a disaster with far-reaching political, social, and economic consequences. The economy was hit hard. The demand for services and goods plummeted, and also critical supply chains were disrupted. The energy sector was also was no exception. Also, it was one of the hardest hit sectors as a result. so because of the low demand, and then the low demand was already there as a result of the price war between the Russian Federation and the Saudis, and also because of the trade war between China and the United States, and also because of the recession which took place in Europe at your EU level and also in China. So we had in the field of energy sector, we already had a problem, and then with COVID-19 we had a terrible oil crash, oil prices crash. So the situation is that in April, only in April, world global energy demand fell by 18%, and the general demand during the first part of this year was 30% low. So the decision to reduce production by the Saudis and the Russians by 10% of the total consumption was not effective enough. So this was the situation as regards oil and energy. But of course, here with this disaster, we should not let, for example, the energy transition process to be disrupted. We need this energy transition process, and here we're talking about renewables, and the former speakers have already dealt with renewables. Renewables might be adversely affected by COVID-19 because apparently, according to Joseph Stiglitz, who believes that the hardest hit economies will be the developing economies, and they should be supported, and because their economies will be consumed by health services and other social services, and they won't have enough resources to invest in renewables, so they should be supported. But also, I believe that many European countries and other countries will not be in a position to put money at this point in time in renewables because of the economic problems that they are facing as a result of the corona virus. So maybe also oil prices, although they rebounded and recovered, I don't expect also a great increase in oil prices. There are some optimists, and I'm not one of them, who say that the worst is of the health crisis is over. The economic recovery might start. A modest recovery in the global economy maybe will be soon with us. Oil prices will recover and so on, because there is this group of people who are quite optimistic about the future. But also there are certain groups like Nouriel Roubini, who was saying that recovery will take time. It will take maybe about 10 years for a full recovery. And then the second wave of the pandemic, with the second wave, it might also hit hard again. So there are also certain people who think that it's not that easy to get over and to leave Corona-19 behind us. So this is quite, I think, important to take into consideration that it's too early to make conclusions about the future of the global economy. But what we learned from the situation is that clean energy, we need this transition, and it should not be compromised. That we need also to fight climate and climate change, and we need to address this climate change because it is really the next existential, maybe it will be a kind of existential threat. Yesterday, I was watching a webinar from the United States, and then they labeled the situation as a perfect storm, the situation in the Caribbean with the pandemic and also the economic crisis together with the hurricane. So it was called the perfect storm. And so also, for example, one of the American banks, I think, yes, they they said that the United States in 2017, it lost with 16 major disasters, climate originated, climate and climate, yes, originally climate disasters, which were 17 together, and then the total loss was $399 billion. So this is why it's so important to consider this situation and try to reorganize. And definitely we need to have new commitments as regards climate change. But it will take time, it will take political will, and probably the international community is not prepared to take new commitments, trying to heal the wounds. But it's so important that we should take the advantage of having now, for example, 8% decrease in the CO2 emissions, and this should continue. For example, it should continue, and I hope that this maybe the only good result of this coronavirus is that the CO2 emissions decreased by 8%, according to Dr. Fatih Birol, who made several statements in this regard. So I think also I should stop here and try to answer any question that might arise. Thank you.
Thank you. It seems to me that what we have are some huge uncertainties. People talk about a V-shaped recovery. Vshaped, you kind of expressed some skepticism about that, but there are still some people out there that expect that this will not be the 2008 recession with a longer recovery, but a quicker recession. And that's based, I guess, on their expectations that a vaccine or something, the virus becoming more less deadly, etc., that somehow we'll just go back to a more normal situation. People start traveling together, etc., etc. You expressed the point of view that a lot of people see this as a much longer recovery. Clearly, we don't know because it depends so much on a medical situation, which clearly none of the experts have been able to predict so far, and are probably not any more able to predict it going forward than they have been so far. So if we do see, though, a more V-shaped recovery, there is some possibility that the lack of investments, which you cite, Vshaped, could cause, for example, in the oil and gas sector, reduced supplies going forward, reduced investments going forward. And if we have a V-shaped recovery, demand surge coming back, and at some point, with prices being brittle and inelastic, maybe a shortage of energy. Does anyone on the panel think that's a likely possibility? Or are we just looking at low oil prices and low gas prices and low electricity prices out into the future? Is there any possibility of anyone on the panel that we might be looking at yo-yo energy prices going up and down? Any volunteers on that?
If I may, Professor, yes, you mentioned the V-shape recovery, but many analysts suggest that it should be either a U shape or L shape, and Rubini suggested that it will be a L shape recovery, and this is why it will take time. But yes, I'm with you as regards the possible investments in oil and other fossil fuels. In fact, the oil investments were hit hard, especially, for example, the offshore investments were shelved, and also the shale gas investments. Many small and medium-sized companies have stopped their activities, and they suffered financial difficulties, in fact. So it remains to be seen whether they will be able to start their activities again in the United States, especially. But as Fatih Birol, when he addressed a group recently in Istanbul, also through a webinar, he suggested that it's not in the interest of the developing world and energy consuming countries to have low oil prices for quite low oil prices. It's not in the interest of the consumers, because then in this case we will have a huge gap of investment gap, and with this investment gap, then it will be, as you rightly said, we will have some fluctuations and turmoil maybe from time to time. So the volatile prices are not in the interest of anybody, and too low prices are not good either. But what we need is to combine, to have a good energy basket with the combination of oil, gas, and also renewables and nuclear, because you know better than I that what we need is a good basket, a sound basket. Renewables are not they're not in a position. Renewable energy is not in a position to stand alone. It has to be supported by fossil fuels, and also according to the International Energy Agency, fossil fuels will remain with us for a long period to come, and gas will be the intermediary, and it will be the rising probably star among the fossil fuels. So this is what I had to say.
Thank you. I'm getting a lot of questions from our audience already, and that's really good. But before I turn to those questions, I did have a couple of my own questions. In particular, I wanted to ask Ahmet Bey. We've been seeing, and this question has really nothing to do with COVID-19 in particular. We've seen a lot of change in the gas market with a lot less reliance on pipeline gas in Europe and in Turkey, a lot more LNG being consumed. Part of this, of course, is the fact that, with the declining demand that is resulting from COVID-19, it's forcing LNG prices down, but they were on a downward trend anyway. So my question to you, Ahmet Bey, is do you see a diminishing influence of oil and gas in the global energy markets, and in particular, the diminishing concern about the dependence on pipeline gas from Russia or any other country in Europe, with more LNG use and more LNG supplies?
Thank you, Carmine. It's difficult to speculate on this, but there are diametrically opposite answers to this question. One is that major large volume buyers that are neighbors to very large producers will continue using pipeline gas. The example is that pipeline is being built, in fact, completed recently, such as the Pride of Siberia pipeline, taking new gas to China. China will have increasing appetite for gas. That doesn't mean that China will not import gas, LNG as well, but given that it has a policy of reducing its dependence on coal, it has a long way to go in terms of connecting to gas sources to make a substantial difference. Europe is again the same way, given what I said about the situation with the prices in Europe. The Russian pipeline connection, regardless of which one it is, still is capable of delivering to Europe gas at very competitive prices. And therefore, it is not likely to be replaced, although Europe will probably bring in increasing quantities or slightly increasing share of LNG. On the other hand, the competitiveness of LNG has certainly helped gas-to-gas competition in driving prices down, a competition that now is working against the shale producers in the United States, but they're also suffering very much from the oil prices. There are already 17 companies that have declared bankruptcy. Some predict that by the end of the year, as many as over 200 companies might close down in the United States. This is oil and gas, but shale. Now, given this situation, we can imagine a scenario in the future where prices might fluctuate. They might fluctuate because investment is falling, and depending on the recovery. And I agree with Ambassador Rende on the recovery, although I am approximately 5% more optimistic than he is. But it is going to take a very long time. It's going to take a very long time, but at some point, this squeezing of money out of investments in the sector and massive bankruptcies in the United States, which is or the major producer of this, at some point it will lead to a market response of upward pressure in prices. That scenario is not something, as Fatih Birol said, it's not something that we would like to see, because volatility in prices really hurts the sector substantially. I don't know whether I've answered all your questions, but thank you, and over to you.
Thank you. I was taken by Deohana, what you said about human rights and about how this can affect contracts. How do individuals relate to human rights on these issues? What rights do individuals have against companies or states in order to achieve a sustainable future for themselves? How does that work?
Thank you, Carmine. First of all, although this issue is very much linked with fundamental human rights, there is no legal liability on the corporations in the international human rights side. I mean, hard law document, we call it. There is no legally binding written document keeping the corporations accountable, liable in the international human rights level. However, there are soft law documents, as you all know. These are mainly corporate social responsibility standards, such as OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and UN guiding principles on business and human rights. UN Global Compact. There's also within the UN, there is an open-ended intergovernmental working group recently published a revised draft legally binding instrument on business activities and human rights. These are all soft law documents. These are not hard law instruments. In terms of individuals bringing action against governments, they basically rely on human rights documents or constitution, because states are legally bounded by international human rights law. Actually, there are more than 1,000 cases ongoing in 33 countries currently. These are climate change related cases. And they are brought against the countries, against the states, and also against the corporations. I will give you a recent example to show you how this might affect the future cases. And this is not a new case, actually, Uganda case. You may have heard of it. And in December 2019, the Supreme Court in the Netherlands ruled that the government is actually has actually a duty of care to its citizens to protect its citizens from climate change in accordance with the obligations under the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights. So, in the court of first instance, the claimants actually made a tort claim. They argued that the government is conducting a tort against its citizens by not reducing the carbon emissions at the scientific levels. And the Supreme Court took this claim to the international human rights level and ruled based on the European Human Rights Convention. So it is a landmark decision which I believe would affect the other cases ongoing in other countries. And there is another recent development, which is a ruling by the Commission of Human Rights of the Philippines. It was a complaint again brought by Filipino citizens against 47 major fossil fuel companies. They basically argued that the climate change related actions of these companies are violations of human rights. And the Commission's ruling is very interesting. It said that even if legal responsibility for climate change is not addressed by current international human rights law, major fossil fuel companies are morally obliged to respect human rights, as specified in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. You can see that the international law is transforming. It transforms to cover environmental obligations, even if these are coming from the soft law principles. The ruling of the courts are important. International law does not consist of only binding legal documents. The rulings of the judges, of the tribunals are also important, how they interpret the international conventions and soft law documents. These are the developments that I can mention in terms of individuals' rights against corporations and states. Carmine.
Thank you. Yes, Vshaped, I have a question for you in particular. It seems like we've had 30 years since we first tried to get an internationally binding agreement on climate change, the Kyoto Protocol. It was never put into force in an effective way. We now have the Paris Accord, although it lacks binding agreements. So far, the achievements in terms of getting the international community, the countries, to accept binding targets, binding agreements that have the force of law, international law, hasn't really worked out. And despite all the evidence that the climate's getting increasingly warmer, that the storms are increasing, that the evidence for catastrophe looming is getting greater and greater, and emissions are not declining, or if they're declining, they're not certainly declining nearly enough in different countries. What is it about the current climate policies that are being undertaken? Do they seem to be working? In other words, even though we don't have this international agreement, in Europe there's been strong climate policies taken. In other countries there have been strong climate policies taken, but we still see either no big reductions in climate emissions or actual increases. Is there something about our climate policies that need to be changed? Do they just need to be stronger? And how important is it to get an international accord that affects all the countries, especially the developing economies, especially in Asia, and the emerging economies in the Middle East and even sub-Saharan Africa, that might be contributing to greenhouse gas emissions in the future?
Yeah, as you said, the Paris Agreement is not working. It's not a binding agreement. It has voluntary emission targets for 2030, and they are not sufficient. And the best one was that came from EU, which suggested that they would reduce their emissions by 40% compared to 1990. Other countries are lower. US was 26, 28%, and China said it will increase, but will reach a peak before 2030. So even these promises were held, we would have a 3 to 4 degree warming of the world by the end of the century. And let alone this, they are not keeping these words. It's questionable whether those voluntary targets will be achieved. So clearly, this is not working. We need something else. And I think two recent ideas that came from, one from EU and one from US. I think I have to mention these two. The one from EU is on Green Deal. The Green Deal has essentially two items that we can talk about. One is the energy transition to low carbon energy, renewable energy, and the other is reduction of energy consumption. And not only reduction of energy consumption, but also reduction of resources. They see 40% potential reduction in the carbon emissions. So that's a huge amount. Energy efficiency, and the other one is, now the term is developing, it's circular economy. By circular economy, what is meant is the things that we produce use less resources. They should be repairable. They should be reusable, though its components should be able to be used in other production. That way, there is a big potential in the savings of resources and energy. That's coming. We don't hear about these, but that's coming. The other of transition, energy transition, will essentially bring carbon tax. There will be a high carbon tax, which will keep on increasing until the level of carbon emissions reach to a proper level. So this is in the works. It's coming. There is one thing that interests countries outside of EU in relation to this, and it is the following. Because of the carbon tax, the imports into EU from other countries will be subject to border adjustment for carbon. If those countries where the exports are originating do not have a similar amount of carbon tax on their energy, then those will be adjusted at the border. So such a tax is coming. I think by the end of this decade, it will be there. It's in the legislation that will be worked next year in 2021. That will be worked. So that's an important one. The other one is essentially is from very similar from US. Actually, in US there are two different proposals. One is from the Democrats and one is from the Republicans. The one from Republicans is, I think, worth looking into it. They also see a carbon tax, a high level of carbon tax, but they will distribute the money collected from this carbon tax to the citizens at equal with equal amount. So every quarter, each citizen will get a check, and that way it will be evenly distributed, and even it will be helping to the low income people. So that's also a possibility. The one coming from Democrats is in some ways similar to this. So I would think during the next session in the US, it's highly probable that such a change will be enacted. That also includes border adjustments, which means those imports coming from countries where there is not enough carbon tax, they will be charged. So these are the two new things that we should be watching. Other countries, developing countries and China, as you said, do not have such explicit proposals on hand. But China is one of the countries that's leading the renewable energy, but it has to adjust to the circular economy as well over the coming months and years.
Thank you. I have to confess that I'm always been a fan of the carbon tax, because it kind of, instead of the government telling people exactly what to do, you should do this or do that, it lets the private sector figure out the best way to deal with the fact that coal and oil and natural gas are more expensive, and then we should use less of it. So I kind of think that it might be an efficient policy, but I know that that's there's a lot of controversy around it, but I think by engaging the full resources of the private sector and industry, that gives them an incentive to save money and make profits, and also gives them a clear knowledge of what carbon is going to be worth in the future. As you say, if the carbon tax is increasing to a high level in the future, they can see that and then make investments that are based on that expectation. So I'm kind of hoping that the carbon tax is one of the ideas. Whatever it is, we need something, because it seems to me that we have to step on the gas harder in terms of doing something about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Just coasting like we are now is not going to get the job done. Like you say, 3 or 4 degree increase is too high. And if that's, the best that we can expect from the current commitments, we've got to do something beyond the current commitments. Otherwise, we're in for a really bad time for, my children and their children. We're getting a lot of good questions.
May I add a few points?
Yes, please do.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vshaped. First of all, as regards climate change, adaptation is more urgent now than ever, and we need to make our societies resilient to hotter climates. And this is why the Green Climate Fund should be more generous and try to assist the countries in need through the Green Climate Funds for adaptation. with respect to the Green Deal, Yashar Bey eloquently explained. It's a very important project, and I think Turkey should be able to follow closely the developments and the implementation of Green Deal, because it is really an ambitious one. It aims at energy systems integration, for example, according to the leadership of the EU. It will upgrade energy infrastructure. They are aiming also at upgrading the energy infrastructure. And energy efficiency, for example, is part of the Green Deal. They are planning to enhance energy efficiency also. And to use hydrogen as an energy carrier. It's also part of the energy, the Green Deal. So all these are important also for Turkey, because also and border adjustment taxes, or let's say the footprints, the CO2 footprints taxes. It's important because Turkey is a major exporter to the EU, and we need to take probably the necessary measures to be able to continue trading with Europe, because they will have we will have some constraints, in fact. Professor, as regards the future of energy, of course, it will depend on also the behavior of the international community. We talked about U-shape, L-shape, V-shape growth, economic recovery, and so on. But still, we don't know what sort of reaction we will have from the international community, from our people, following COVID-19. Will they continue, for example, with their lifestyles? Now we have been locked down for 3 weeks, 3 months here in Istanbul. If they let us go tomorrow, would we be able to go and spend money? Would we be able to go and use like buses and undergrounds and so on? And probably it will take some time before we change our lifestyle, and we will be quite cautious. So this is why it's too early to say whether, for example, the worst is over and the economic recovery is starting and so on. So the human behavior is very important here. Lord Brown recently made an interesting statement. He's the former BP head, and he said that human beings have suffered through this COVID, let's say, it destroyed our lungs, or destroyed hundreds of thousands of people, and when our lungs we are so lung conscious now, we're trying to protect our lungs, and this is why, for example, when we overcome this terrible pandemic, probably we will continue to care about air pollution, for example. We will continue to have a good environment, maybe renewables. This is why we will be maybe more eager to use renewable energy and so on. So still, we need time to make conclusions about the future of our lifestyle and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. And I actually have a question. I'm starting to look at the questions I'm getting. There are many questions here. One question, I want to pick it up because it's kind of a practical Turkish question, not so much about COVID-19, but more, standard energy kind of question. And it has to do with the expiring long-term pipeline contracts and what should be done about them. The person asking the question, Mr. Akbey, he's interested in knowing about whether or not these contracts should be extended. Should they be utilized for providing spot gas supply, for flexibility? What would be the impact of the development of these contracts on our suppliers? So that would be a good question, I think, for both you, Vshaped Bey, and for Ahmed Bey.
Please, Ahmed Bey. Would you like to start?
Well, let me say briefly that it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity because these contracts that are expiring were long-term contracts, I believe 25 years at much higher rates. So if the pipelines are there, I'm sure they will be utilized, but the opportunity is that they will be utilized to supply gas at a more reasonable rate. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ahmed Bey. Yes, the long-term contracts will be negotiated. We will have to renegotiate or negotiate new contracts. And here, of course, the old contracts were oil indexed, and this is why we bought and we consumed the most expensive natural gas on Earth, and this is why. Probably it's quite a good time for us, given the market conditions, to negotiate new contracts. But I would suggest that they should not be oil price indexed. That we should have shorter term contracts, and we are in a position also to look strong around the table when we negotiate, because we have managed to create a good LNG infrastructure, and with the LNG storage capacities to grow. So we have a certain degree of demand elasticity, which could carry us, for example, towards good results. But definitely we need to negotiate carefully, and probably as we have gas glut globally, so there is no need to panic, or there is no need to hurry things, to rush things. So we will have to carefully negotiate with our friends. I believe that with the Iranians, still we have time until 2026. But with the Russian Federation, I think next year we will have to negotiate new contracts, and it's very important that now the market conditions are in our favor, and we need to be very careful in concluding these contracts, and they should be short-term, not long-term, preferably.
Without take-or-pay guarantees, maybe.
Yes, and the take-or-pay, yes, this is a clause we should also be, for example, get rid of. And also we should be able, the destination clause should also be negotiated. This is also a big handicap for us, because if Turkey is aiming at becoming an energy hub or a gas trading hub, we need to be able to market part of the gas that we will have in Turkey. If we don't need, probably we will buy more than what we need in Turkey through new contracts. And this is why the destination clause should be avoided. It's so important that we should be able to sell gas to our other neighbors and to establish Turkey as a gas hub in the real sense of the word.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a kind of a general question that I think any of the panelists can answer, volunteers, is like, we've got these low energy prices we're looking at. How big a problem is this going to be for adopting more energy efficiency and getting away from fossil fuels? If oil prices and gas prices are down, is this going to be an impediment in investing in the capital intensive energy sources? We talk about how renewable energy is the least expensive form of producing electricity. But if we look at electric vehicles, they're really not the least expensive way to get around. They might be the least expensive way in terms of the cost of driving a kilometer. But in terms of the overall cost of ownership so far, it's a fairly expensive idea. So, and if, fuel prices are getting lower and natural gas prices are getting lower, how much is this actually going to retard investments in clean energy? Any volunteers on that?
I think I can say a few words.
Thank you.
Of course, low energy prices will deter investment in fossil fuels. And that's also the new trend. As more people realize the potential impact of climate change, investors are pursuing companies in which they invest to divest from, to stay away from fossil fuel investments. And there are so many of these. I mean, one of the most recent one is just last month, all right, in April, the BlackRock, the huge investment fund with $6.5 trillion under its management. BlackRock CEO has written to the CEOs all the companies where they have investment, and they ask them essentially to watch for green investments, stay away from emission creating investments. I think that's a very important one, and a similar approach is coming from the central banks. The most significant one is the Bank of America former CEO Mark Carney, who instituted a stress test for large financial institutions. They were due this year, but due to coronavirus, they have been postponed to next year. So all these large financial institutions will be under stress for their environmental or climate risks. So that's driving many companies away from investing in fuel-related areas. And the sums of money that's being considered is very high. That will create implications for investing in those companies. And when the fuel prices are low, they'll keep investors still further. So I think this will speed up the transition to low carbon emission fuels.
Thank you. I have a bunch of questions here that are interesting, one of which has to do with the issue that has been raised already in terms of Vshaped has already talked about the EU policies and how it's going to affect the border tax issues with other countries, and in particular with Turkey. So I've got a question here about if the EU has this border tax, which effectively, as you point out, creates a tax on carbon. What's this going to do to the lignite use in Turkey, the coal development in Turkey? How much do you think that'll retard plans to expand local use of lignite in the power sector? Any volunteers to answer that question?
I may take this question. Yes, in fact, the problem in Turkey is coal is subsidized, and it's encouraged and subsidized, and probably for a period of time we will be consuming our indigenous energy resource to balance our budget, and coal and lignite especially will be with us, but probably it should not be supported or subsidized. It's a big problem, and we're going to face difficulties because of the fact that Turkey is subsidizing coal. In the long run, we need to upgrade coal-fired power plants, and if possible, and hopefully, we should stop maybe investing, and we will have difficulties in finding foreign investors to finance coal-fired systems. So yes, if, for example, in 10 years from now, that the European Union will establish their own carbon tax, and then we will be generating electricity and building vehicles and other materials and commodities to export, probably the EU will come up with a proposal or with a decision that they will say that the carbon print of this product is so high that we need to put 10% or 5% tax. So it's very important, in fact, to consider. But I understand that the former energy minister declared that at least we will have to use coal and lignite for the next 20 years. And we are not historically responsible for the CO2 emissions worldwide. Turkey was not an emitter, basically. And we have the special circumstances as regards climate change principles and agreements. So this is what I had to say about it.
I can say a few words about that. I think Turkey's policy is very clear. I mean, we're trying to reduce our dependency on Russian gas, etc. So we need to use Turkish renewables and local. We only have local coal, so it is a very difficult position. And I think for imported materials to Europe, yes, it will be very important to see what would be the policy of the Turkish government in terms of coals. But I think Turkish companies will have a tendency to have maybe corporate PPA agreements or renewable green certificates, these kind of instruments they would have to use to avoid carbon tax.
Well, since we're talking about coal, I mean, one of the, it's a baseload power source, 24/7 type plant. It does follow load to some extent, but it's basically a baseload concept. High capital investment, relatively lower fuel costs compared to, say, natural gas. What about nuclear power? I mean, here you have a high capital cost, a very low fuel costs, and it's a baseload 24/7 plant. If you use less coal and lignite, one of the alternatives to having baseload power is nuclear power. Everybody knows, of course, at least everybody in Turkey knows, that at Akku, there's the 2 plants are being built right now by Rosatom. It's a build, own, operate project where Rosatom builds the plant, owns the plant, and operates the plant. And Turkey's commitment is a power purchase agreement. If all four plants are built, the overall power purchase agreement is for 50% of the power. It's 70% for the first 2 plants and 30% for the last 2 plants, which of course are in the future. The first 2 plants are being built right now. Future Turkish power plants may be more of the conventional arrangement where an entity, the government or some government agency purchases the plant from a vendor. That's the normal way that nuclear power plants are built. Does anybody on the panel have a reaction to Turkey's increased use of nuclear power as a way of turning away from coal, perhaps, and providing baseload power with low greenhouse gas emissions? And even though the fuel rods from these plants might have to be imported from the supplying country, the vendor, certainly the cost of these fuel rods is very low compared to the cost of natural gas or coal or oil or any other fuel. So what's the reaction to that by anybody that might want to speak to it? What about public reaction, concern about safety, that sort of thing?
May I take this question?
Please.
Thank you. I had the pleasure of sitting on the Nuclear Energy Commission of Turkey for about 4 years. So therefore, I thought I might say a few words. First of all, according to the Turkish energy strategy, of course, nuclear is part of the energy basket, and it should be there. I'm one of the opponents of having a nuclear share in our energy basket, and therefore we supported the establishment of this capacity. So it should we should have like 10%. Maximum 10% of our energy need should be met by nuclear energy. But of course, you're right that it has its own problems. First of all, we have to negotiate. We have to negotiate new contracts. Put aside the Akku. Akku is under construction, but then we need to negotiate for the second and third nuclear power stations, and it's very important during the negotiations to to have a text with no ambiguities. It's so important. There are certain elements here which should be taken into consideration. Some certain points. The nuclear safety is very, very important, and also we need to enhance in Turkey the safety culture. We need to also educate our people and also prepare our own engineers to run the power stations. And when we sign contracts, as I said, it's not like a political declaration. It's a legal, it's a legal text. And here, Dayar Hanım, I hope that she will be with me, that there should be no ambiguity in legal text. No different interpretations of clauses and so on. For example, how to commission a plant, how to decommission it, and what sort of, for example, fuel that should be provided, and for how long it should be provided. For example, if you have the fuel for 2 years, it's acceptable, but not only for 6 months. So not every 6 months you should just knock the door of the provider and say, oh, I'm running out of fuel. So it's very important. All these points should be taken into consideration when we negotiate new contracts. So.
Mm-hmm. Of course, in the case of the coup, the fuel cycle is totally within Rosatom's domain. I mean, Turkey doesn't have to ask for the new fuel rods for a plant that Rosatom owns. That's going to be their responsibility to keep the plant running. If they don't keep the plant running, they don't make any money selling power from the plant.
Yes, but the point I wanted to make is that, yes, Rosatom will be running the plant, but also Rosatom should be obliged to store fuel rods for at least 2 years of consumption. So this amount should be stored in Turkey. This is what I meant. Not every 6 months. Rosatom should provide the fuel. So to guarantee, if worst comes to worst, to guarantee that there will be enough fuel to run the plants to place until we find some alternative energy resources.
Okay. Are you talking about the fuel cycle in terms of the disposal of the spent fuel rods? I mean, I'm a little confused by that. I take it that the fuel cycle is between Rosatom and Russia, that the spent fuel rods go back to Russia for disposal, and when every 2 years or so the reactor needs refueling, they bring in their own fuel rods and refuel the reactor. So your concern is that they should be keeping spare fuel rods on site well before they need to be replaced.
Professor, waste treatment is very important in when you deal with nuclear energy. One of the major points is waste treatment, and who is responsible for what here. It's not only decommissioning, because decommissioning should take place in 60 years or 70 years, but waste treatment is important. And also, in my view, also storing enough fuel at the plant in the place is important.
Anybody else have comments on the IICEC plant or the nuclear plans of the government in general? I mean, the IICEC plan is just the beginning of the government's plans. The old vendors seem to be in trouble. You know, Westinghouse Toshiba obviously has run into gigantic problems in the United States. A plant that the utility had already spent $6 billion in North Carolina on a plant and then walked away from it with nothing except a partly built reactor. Other reactors double cost, another 6-7 years time overrun, huge financing costs. So Areva, similar problems, starting with the plant that started many years ago in Finland that still isn't finished. And the vendors that seem to be emerging out of the picture are Rosatom, China, and South Korea. So, you know, who you turn to buy a nuclear power plant from has moved from the OECD to outside the OECD, but although still South Korea is in the picture. So it's going to be interesting to see what kinds of arrangements are going to be made with these countries like China and Russia, who are just new to the question of selling nuclear reactors, but obviously they're quite committed to it. And they seem like they're going to be very competitive if the nuclear power business goes forward, and in particular supplying reactors to Middle Eastern countries, which seem to be quite eager to buy them. So any other comments on nuclear power by the panel? There? Okay.
Was widely covered, Professor, apparently.
Okay, very good. We only have a few more minutes.
I have a point to make if you have a few more minutes.
Well, I was going to ask everybody to kind of, before we conclude, everybody to sort of make a final wrap-up round, like a minute each round. So do you want to start that wrap-up round, and then we can go across the table?
Yeah, with pleasure. I would like to share one concern with the audience, with the participants, and that is the exposure of Turkish banks to foreign currency loans granted to energy companies. This is also when we discuss energy and energy-related issues. I think this is one of the problems that we are facing, and it's a big challenge indeed. So the exposure of Turkish banks for the time being is quite challenging, and it has to be resolved. Hopefully, when we overcome this disaster, that we will have the necessary business environment. We will be able to establish a conducive environment for foreign investment, for foreign investors, and then maybe they will be interested in Turkey's Turkey's assets, and then maybe it will help Turkish banks to overcome this problem that they are facing.
Thank you. I'm going the opposite direction that we began. Amit Bey, final comments?
Yes, thank you. Let me come back to the present crisis and some of the effects of that in global geopolitics, a topic we did not really touch upon. Of course, we cannot touch upon this vast area of concern in an hour and a half. But I did mention, for example, the shape of the American shale producers, and that is they are in very serious shape, and but also it seems that the Saudis and Moscow had nearly a Pyrrhic victory in pushing these prices down. They did, of course, want to get the American competition out, and they managed it at their own peril. Now, if we look at the situation with Saudi Arabia, the reserves of Saudi Arabia, it fell from 726 billion to 500 billion. The last crisis is now even below that amount. Now, this is important for Saudi Arabia's stability in the sense that oil and gas represents 50% of Saudi Arabia's GDP, as compared to the sector, oil and gas sector, representing only 8% of the US GDP. So it is quite interesting to see Saudi Arabia sort of panicking to shift huge amounts of funds to act like an investor to pick up Western shares to the tune of maybe 40 or 50 billion dollars to bring money instead of oil and gas, bring money back to Saudi Arabia, expecting a recovery of European and American markets. Russia, likewise, is very much hurt by these prices. We look at Russia is expected to have a budget shortfall in the federal budget of $39 billion. The ruble equivalent is huge, but it doesn't make much sense. It can be devalued. $39 billion. Now, 2018 is the last figure I have for Russia. In 2018, oil and gas represented 46% of Russia's all budget revenues. That is, again, a very difficult situation. And all of this really shows that the situation is such that the future is not immediately predictable. It can cause volatility, all kinds of volatility, not only the price volatility that we talked about, but also political volatility in terms of not meeting the expectations of the people. And this is reflected in some news items coming reported out of Russia, the fall in Putin's popularity. We do not have a chance to really peer into the internal workings of Saudi Arabia, but the situation of not meeting the expectations in a traditionally rentier state has its own dangers. I just wanted to touch upon this geopolitical aspect of this crisis, and we don't see the recovery, and there again I am not as pessimistic as Ambassador Rende, but I am sufficiently pessimistic to see that we will not see a kind of recovery very soon to mend these serious shortfalls. Thank you. Over to you.
Professor, Professor, the pessimistic scientist is Nouriel Roubini. Sorry, he was, I referred to.
Sorry. I'm going to be going about 10 minutes over, but we will be concluding close to on time. And Dare Hanum, please, your concluding remarks.
Yes. I have discussed a little bit about international instruments requiring, whether there's any international instrument requiring the investments to be sustainable. And I said there is no hard law document, but I would like to mention a little bit about the recent developments in the international investment law. Although there is no legally binding hard law document, in terms of investment treaties, there are recent developments. What is an investment treaty? Investment treaty is basically an agreement between states, and states provide the investors of the other state with certain rights, like fair and equitable treatment, most favored nation treatment, or national treatment, protection and full security, etc. So the investors, for the enforcement of these rights, they have a right to go to the arbitration against the states. So I will give you an example how they can use this mechanism. For example, a Swedish investor called Vattenfall, they had a coal-fired power plant in Germany. And when Germany adopted certain environmental restrictions to impose, to reduce carbon emissions, this investor brought an arbitration case against Germany and arguing that the carbon reduction actually makes their investment unfeasible. So they said it's violation of fair and equitable treatment in the Energy Charter Treaty. This is an example how it can be used as a tool to challenge states' environmental or other public policy concerns measures. So as I said, under these investment treaties, they have broad range of rights. But these investment treaties have been highly criticized by being one-sided, not protecting public policy concerns like environmental rights or human rights. And the criticism was mostly based on the environmental and human rights destruction of the investors. So upon these critics, since the beginning of 2000, we see new generation bilateral investment treaties being signed in between the states. And new generation investment treaties makes a reference to public policy concerns. And they sometimes make a reference in their preambles to environmental rights, human rights, sustainable development concerns. Sometimes they make exception in the BIT in terms of excluding certain state measures from investors' protections. And by the way, Turkey is following this new trend very much. You can see almost all the new treaties of Turkey signed after 2011 following this trend, new generation BIT trend. And another development other than the new generation BITs is the human rights and environmental counterclaims brought by the states against investors. And how it is possible. Normally, investment arbitration is a tool for investors to take the state liable, but we see increasing counterclaims, human rights counterclaims by the states against the investors. I will give you a few examples. For example, there are two cases brought by oil companies against Ecuador. These are two separate cases, actually. And oil companies challenged oil production tax brought by Ecuador. And Ecuador brought a counterclaim, environmental counterclaim in these cases, and said that and challenged companies' environmental destruction on the Ecuadorian Amazon. So these are the, you can see that the corporations or investors can be held liable for their human rights or environmental harm. So, and interpretation by the tribunals are also becoming very interesting. And in one of the recent cases, the tribunal analyzed whether the investors are under liability under the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So even if it is, as I said in the beginning of my conversation, even if it is not a hard law document, and even if it is not binding on the investors in terms of positive obligation, the court goes on to say that the investor is under negative obligation under the UN declaration. So we see a lot of development in terms of tribunal interpretations or international courts or even national courts, so that the international law seems to be developed in a way to cover environmental rights, not only on the side of the state, but also on the corporation side. So even if there is no hard law document to require the investors to be sustainable, investments to be sustainable, I believe that the investors of which activities are not sustainable may have difficulties in terms of their investment rights against states, and they may even face with counterclaims in the future. It is a very growing trend. Thank you.
Thank you. And Vshaped, your final comments.
I want to come back to the COVID-19 situation that we are now. Many countries are proposing crisis, and that amounted to trillions of dollars. Now, it's a time when we can use such stimulus to support the green energy. And actually, so many prominent people are talking about this. For example, most recently, Dr. Fatih Birol has has asked state. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yes. So many, such as Fatih Birol, has asked the states to put the clean energy at the heart of their recovery plans. And not only Fatih Birol, again, the BlackRock CEO has written to the companies to consider green investments in these times. So I think much can be achieved by stimulating the green investments at this time. I will tell you an example. For example, recently in France, the government has asked Air France to stop flying between on certain domestic flights where there is a competing high-speed train line, or they forgive the state aid coming for this purpose. So many countries, many companies will be facing with some of these realities. Unfortunately, we haven't heard anything about this in Turkey. I think a good one in Turkey could be renovation of buildings. For example, in EU, by 2050, all current and new buildings should be net zero emitting buildings. So government at this time can stimulate some of these actions and propose more companies, more houses are renovated, and that way we can have a benefit of this coronavirus for the green investments.
Thank you very much. Well, we're at the end of our webinar, and I'd like to thank our panel for their excellent comments and the answers to the many questions that they've fielded. I also want to thank all of you who are watching our webinar, and especially those that provided the many questions that made our discussion that much more interesting. Clearly, I wasn't able to include all of them as we didn't have the time to deal with all the questions that we did receive. And finally, please look for the registration link for our next webinar that will be held later in the month, featuring Ms. Güler-Sabancı, Dr. Fatih Birol, and Mr. Kıvanç Zaimler. And with that, I am concluding the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.